Bienvenidos and welcome VRoid enthusiasts. My name is Crossbite, and today, instead of a dedicated tutorial, I figured we could look at some of the tips and tricks that I've picked up along the way in my many hours in VRoid Studio, and I'd like to share those with you today. We are going to cover a lot of topics, but I think they're going to be helpful no matter what your skill level is, and I think it's going to help to give us all better models overall in the end. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to mention is you should save often, like very often. And if you're going to do something big, you're going to get into a big part of your model, such as developing the hair or redesigning the clothes, I also recommend that you make a backup save. So that way, if you mess something up or for some reason VRoid crashes, you have a couple of saves to go back to. Don't be afraid to make backups of the backups even, because sometimes things go awry and you're going to need those. The next thing I want to note is, before you really get into making your model, I recommend going into the general settings and messing with the lighting and shading and outline to what's going to be appropriate for your model. A lot of people don't like to have any shading or lighting or anything like that, so that's up to you. Some people have great designs that have really strong outlines. Some people do pretty good with lighting. Personally, I think a little bit of lighting and shading is fine, but I don't like any outline. The next thing I want to talk about is with hair. The quickest tip I can give you is use the mirror tool as you're drawing out the hair initially. When you're fleshing out how the design is going to look overall, you probably want to have that mirror tool. And second, it's going to save you time because you're drawing twice as many hairs, so that essentially cuts your draw time in half. So use the mirror tool. If you forget to use the mirror tool, you can always clone and then flip the hair. You're going to lose the adjustment point mirroring like you would if it was truly mirrored. But if you're all set with it and you're not going to make too many adjustments, that's a quick time saver for you. Instead of having to redraw the hair, just do a clone and a flip, and you'll get the exact image on the opposite side. The next thing I want to talk about with hair is that you can adjust the curves manually. I usually recommend just leaving them at fluffy, but then I will adjust the points at the beginning or end depending on if I want to have flat ends or pointy ends. If you've seen my other tutorials about hair, I usually talk about this quite a bit. It's all dependent on the style you want, but keep in mind that you can change those manually. To get to the next part of the tutorial, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to quickly throw together some hair for this character. I'm going to do a freehand group in the front and a procedural group in the back. And we're going to go ahead and just throw something together real quick and see what comes out of it. Alright, so we're done. We've got our hair here. Nothing too fancy, but it's going to work for us today. The next tip I want to give you based on this is, if you just draw one section of hair, or one group of hair, or two groups of hairs, it's going to look pretty flat. So I recommend taking whatever you've drawn and duplicating it, and then bringing it into the scalp a little bit. This is going to help give you a little bit of depth and kind of make your hair look a little more full. And it's also going to save you some time with messing with the thickness and the width and redrawing additional hairs if that's the route you're going to take. Don't worry if it dips into the skull a little bit. The basis here is really to just give you kind of an additional layer of hair underneath your base layer, just to make it look a little more full. As you can see, it's nothing too grand or spectacular, but it is going to help bring out the fullness in the hair. And you can also do this in the reverse direction and put additional hair on top, but that's probably going to need more work because people are going to see that and you may need to clean it up more. Next I want to talk about hexadecimal colors. If you have Photoshop, you can choose the color picker, and then you're going to get your hex code right there within the color picker. You can copy and paste that right into VRoid, or use something like HTML color codes, or another system that's going to give you those codes. And that's only in the event that you can't really make a decision on what colors you want and you need some kind of outside guidance. Additionally, the eyedropper tool within VRoid works on any color in VRoid, and that includes things like the backgrounds, the toolbars, etc. So I'm going to grab a toolbar color here and actually going to use that as the basis for my hair. So there's a couple different ways to add color to things like hair and clothing. And you have your base color, and you have the option to draw it on layers. I always recommend working in a lot of different layers no matter what you're doing, but we're going to get back into that in just a second here. As we're going through this, I wanted to show you that highlights are a tricky thing to work with, and it's my personal recommendation that you keep your highlights minimal or it's better to just set the color to black so the highlights don't show up at all, because these require a lot of adjustments if you're very new to VRoid. If you get pretty skilled with it and you're pretty familiar, you may actually want to get in some highlights and kind of give it a funky color, or just make it pop a little bit, but highlights can take a little bit of time. And I do want to make that note real quick. As I'm using this kind of bluish color hair, I'm going to put on these bluish color highlights just so you can see how that looks. But back to what I was saying about layers, I'm going to go ahead and create a duplicate of our base image. I'm going to make it all white. I'm going to go ahead and take my blue layer, and I'm going to show you, if I make my base color blue as well, that makes it super dark. It's not the color I wanted, because it's taking that layer color and applying it against the base color. So if I want to actually have my true blue that I chose, I would have to have a white base color to keep my true blue color that I selected. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that blue layer, and as you can see, I have a lot more freedom here if I use the tools on the right side, especially the composition. So you wouldn't get this if you have your colors set just at the base level, which is why I recommend using layers for your colors, because you have the ability to mix and match, adjust the saturation as you're trying to draw out your texture. For example, you can mess with your colors on this and see how they're going to look using the opacity or the composition. So you have a lot more freedom if you do that with the layers, as opposed to just setting a static color on the base. Again, that's just a personal recommendation. If you're just doing something super quick, you're very welcome to just go ahead and set the base color to whatever color you want your hair to be. But this is a really good tip, I think, because you can really get some good color combinations with the different layers, and you don't have to keep drawing over the same default image or the same layer over and over again. You can have different layers for different colors if you're going to change your hairstyle constantly, or if you want to get weird effects with it. This is going to be the way to get that done. I'm going to go ahead and create a red layer here, and I'm going to keep my blue layer as well. So I have my red layer, I have my blue layer. I can go ahead and mix those colors and mess around with them and see how they look, and if I don't like them mixed, I can just hide one layer and I can have my character with red hair, I can have my character with blue hair. So this is just the quick way to do that. And as I mentioned, you can just draw on those layers and not impact the other layers that you know you like. So I'm going to go ahead and move on from that, and we're going to go on to clothing. I have a couple quick tips for clothing. First one is pretty similar to what we've already talked about. Keep working in layers. So as you can see, I'm just drawing in on a separate layer. Don't feel free to hide any accessories here. What I'm doing is I'm just drawing on a separate layer with this green color that I've got. And I'm going to go ahead and choose color burn. I'm also going to duplicate this layer and create a multiply. And these are both darken types of blending. And what that's going to do for us is the color burn is going to help bring out the saturation of the default image, the very, very base image that VRoid gives you of the dress. And then the multiply is going to help remove all the white from that. So you're going to get this end result here, which is a really deep green with some great shading. If you just set the base color to the green we're using, you're going to get a lot of highlights that you don't want. So that's kind of just reinforcing why I recommend using layers to do your colors. But again, it's not required depending on how you want to do this. I also like to mess with the shade. You can actually make your shade look more like a highlight. That's optional. That's totally up to you depending on what you're going for, but that's just another quick tip for you. The next thing I recommend is, if you're very new to VRoid, make a duplicate of your iris while you're doing your eyes, because if you screw up your eyes completely and you don't have your iris, you're gonna kind of be struggling to get some eyes in there, and that's pretty important. I usually like to just draw them right in on a separate layer. Sometimes, depending on the circumstances, you might want to go to an outside program like Photoshop or something like that. You also have the ability, of course, to draw your highlights directly on the eyes instead of keeping the highlight as a separate item. This is good if you don't like the way that highlights work in external programs like VC Face or VMagic Mirror, because those systems do treat them as outside entities above the eye. So if you don't like the way those look, draw them right on a separate layer, or you can even draw them right on your eyes in the iris section. But you also have the ability to redo your highlights, and personally I don't like the highlights that are default, so I always draw those separately. But again, up to you. You have a couple options there with the eye highlights. Lastly, with all the different options you have for shading and eyelashes and things like that, I like to kind of match them with the color of the character I'm working on, or I'll just set them to a really dark gray. Again, that's all kind of preference, but I think it's a good tip to kind of make your character stand out. You may note that by default the pinkness of the shading is pretty intense, so I like to change the skin shading. Again, I base that off of the color scheme that my character has. So because this character has greens and blues, I don't want that weird pink kind of contrasting against that. So I'm going with kind of, I don't know if you'd call it a green or yellow, but I think it complements the colors that I'm going with much better. So keep that in mind as you're designing your character, of what colors are going to be complementing and which ones are going to be contrasting. Now that we've got a pretty good looking character, I want to mess with her proportions and show you a few tricks here. The first thing that I'd like to note is you can go beyond what the sliders offer you, and that applies to both positive and negative numbers. You can type in any number, even if it's not within the slide parameters. So if you want to have super tall or super short or crazy proportions, you can do that. A lot of people like to mess with the bust, which is understandable, but the bust really breaks your model if you go too big. And a lot of these will actually break your model if you go too big, especially with the clothing. So your clothing choices are going to factor into this, depending on what proportions you want to have. You're going to get a lot of clipping if the clothing is too tight on the skin and your proportions are too big. But just for the sake of this tutorial, we're going to go ahead and give her some thick thighs. We're going to crank up the waist pretty high there. And as you can see, creating her height beyond what we should is breaking her clothing in the back there. So I'm going to go ahead and correct that, because that's not going to be one that's an easy fix. So we're going to give her super high waist parameters, and we'll give her a fairly big chest, just so you can kind of see what you can work with here. But I already can see that there's going to be problems with this, and as we can see now, with the walking animation, you can see the hands are clipping through the dress. Her clothing looks like it's ripping on the sides. So these are kind of the things you got to keep in mind if you're going beyond the boundaries of the sliders. I hope this was helpful for you. If it was, please give me a thumbs up. If not, give me a thumbs down. Follow me on some other social media if you're interested in that, and I will catch you guys next video. See ya!